This is a strategy chart training where I'm hoping that by the end of this, we will get a really good sense of the basics around strategy and how to strategize, with specific outcomes being an understanding of the concept of power, familiarity with the elements of a strategy chart, and then some potential next steps for how we can start to apply what we've learned today. So before we get started, I would love for people to put their introductions in the chat for the sake of time. So name, pronoun, location, org, if you're with any other org besides the Sierra Club, and any roles that you play. So whether that's staff with a position, or if you're a volunteer with a particular role on any committee, feel free to put that in the chat. And I have an icebreaker question to get us to start thinking about strategy. Put in the chat the last time you used strategy, and don't think too big. This could be as simple as how you get ready for work in the morning. What's the strategy you use for that? How do you get your kids to school on time? You know, any little bit of strategy that you use in the past. So go ahead and put that in the chat, and I'll read out some strategies as they come in. But as y'all are putting all of that in there, give you a quick overview of the training, the order that I'm going to go in. So I'm first going to talk to y'all about the concept of power, go over a few misconceptions along with some truths, and then present the Hermes principles, which I'm sure a lot of us here have heard before. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between a strategy chart and a campaign plan. And then we're going to dive into the strategy chart itself, where I'm going to show you a template, some examples, and kind of go through piece by piece of it. So got some strategies coming in here. Let's see. Just this afternoon, Kendra used strategy to decide to make a crock pot dinner later this week when she won't have time to do it in the evening to cook. That's a great example. It shows, first of all, you've got a timeline in there. There's a time that I want to have this dinner, but a time that I'm going to need in order to do it. I'm not going to have that time later. I have that time now. So I'm going to do it now to achieve my objective, which is to have a nice crock pot dinner. Let me read out one other one here. Somebody else used the strategy to organize how to fit everything in, like figuring, let's see. Yeah, how to fit everything in one day. I know I get that issue a lot. It seems like we never have enough time in one day. So every day, I think we're all using strategies to decide, am I going to do X, Y, and Z, or A, B, C? What's my priority for today versus my priority for tomorrow? So it sounds like we all here have an understanding, some kind of a inherent understanding of what strategy is. And so all we're going to be doing is taking this concept, putting some names to the different pieces of it, and looking at how we can apply the strategy to something much broader than just what we're going to have for dinner or what we're going to do for today. So can somebody, I want to, some people, feel free to come off mute or put your hand up or put it in the chat. When I say power, what comes to mind for you? Cool. Julia's saying people, access. It's great. Got some +1s on people. More people. I love it. Does anybody want to go off mute and tell us what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of power?
Decision making.
Decision making. That's a great one. We've got corporations, connections and outreach, the ability to influence decisions, ability to get something done. So these are all great, great ideas of what power is. And I'd say really it comes down to that. It's decision making. It's the ability to affect change of some kind. Now, the reason I want to start off with this is because a lot of people have some misconceptions when it comes to power. We've all heard a lot of these things before, right? Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? That only bad people want power, that being power hungry is a bad thing to be. So the truth is that power is what you do with it. So the thing is that without power, like I said before, we can change nothing. So if we care about this world, if we care about the environment and we care about its people, then we want power and we need power in order to protect these things that we care about. Um, and I think a lot of people, something that the chat is getting to is that some people pointed out people and some other people pointed out corporations as power. And this is a great transition to the way we often look at power when it comes to organizing, is that there's really only two types of power in this world. There's organized people and organized money. And oftentimes our opponents are the ones who have money, and their money is organized in the form of PACs and different groups in their corporations, in lobbying firms, things like that. So their money is organized and they have a lot of it. The difference is that we have the people and we have a lot, our people is much more powerful than their money. The key is to organize the people. Without the people being organized, that power can't be directed towards what it is that we think needs to happen. Um, Another thing about power to keep in mind as we move on with this conversation is that power wins campaigns, but at the same time, campaigns build power. It's a two-way street. So we need power to win campaigns, but we need campaigns to also keep building our power for us to be able to accomplish even bigger wins in the future. And we don't just want power just to accomplish the goal that we have. We are specifically trying to upend the systems of power that we have in our society today. So we're doing this by trying to empower the marginalized, directly impacted, the people, the ones who are going to be most affected by the situation, giving them the decision making, them the ability to affect change when they really haven't had it, in at least not in my entire lifetime. And this requires resisting things like white supremacy, the patriarchy, classism. These are all structures of power in which we exist under. And in every step of our campaign, we're going to have to reckon with that and try to fight against it. So that was a quick overview on power. And before we move on, I just want to point something out. Power, diversity, the Hermes principles, strategizing. These are all things that we could spend 8 hours today talking about. We could really dig in deep on this. So this is a bit of a really rushed, very condensed, abridged version of some of these trainings that I'm trying to put together all at once. So don't worry about remembering every little detail. Just try to keep in mind the concepts, the main ideas. So in this case, for power, we need it if we want to win, and we need the campaigns in order to build it. And we're trying to empower the people, not just ourselves. Now, I want to put in the chat the link to the Hermes principles, because this is something that the Sierra Club is signed on to. And it's a list of values that underlies our theory of change, the way we believe we should go about getting power and using power. I won't go over the entire document, but I definitely recommend that people spend some time to read it. It's just one page, but basically the main ideas of that document is that we need to be inclusive. We need to focus on bottom up, the organizing. We need to let people speak for themselves, work together in solidarity and mutuality, build just relationships among ourselves, and have a commitment to self-transformation. So all of these are important pieces to keep in mind so that we can win our campaigns while making sure that we upend these systems of power, like the patriarchy, white supremacy, classism, and build a future that is truly just. So we're not just getting climate victories, we're getting climate justice victories from all of the work that we do. So I'm gonna pause for just a second. Any thoughts so far? Anything, any questions people have? Anything that's just come to mind that you want to shout out there? Okay, seeing none. I'm gonna move
Oh,
on.
I have
Sure.
one, just remembered a title from a career book I looked at, which the subtitle was How to Win the Rat Race Without Becoming a Rat.
That's a great title. Do you remember, was there like a big idea, something that you learned from that? How to avoid being a rat?
Uh, I know I read it like over a decade ago, so I have the book in my bookshelf. I don't want to spend time now retrieving it unless you really want me to find something out in it.
No, that's okay, but it's what I like about that is it's good to keep in mind that while we do want power, it is important to keep in mind that we don't want to act like those in power at the moment. So our we want to use our power justly. So yeah, it's how do we win the rat race without being a rat, I think is a great way to put it. Any other questions or thoughts people have? Cool. So strategy chart versus a campaign plan. I know that a lot of us, we hear these terms get thrown around a lot, strategizing, planning, campaign planning. So I want to put a question out there. Can anybody tell me the difference between a strategy chart and a campaign plan?
Hmm.
Or even forget about the chart, just the difference between a strategy and a campaign plan.
Well, my take is that strategy looks at a longer term than campaign.
Okay, that's definitely one piece of it.
Is campaign maybe more how to organize the groups and create a drawing of responsibilities? And a strategy is the steps you need to take to win a project. Perhaps, I don't know.
Yeah, those are definitely elements of both strategies and campaign plans. Lynn, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I was going to say what Mary said, that strategy is the action steps, what you need to do to accomplish the goals that you have in a campaign plan.
Right. So I think
It's a piece.
it's a little bit the other way around. So a strategy is the overarching, right? It's the big picture where you're looking at what are you first of all, you're choosing what are the goals, and then what's all of the conditions around the goals and around ourselves that's going to determine our behavior moving forward. What are all of the pieces on the chessboard, all of the different people, the resources that we have. That's where we're essentially taking stock of everything. And then a campaign plan is where we're taking all of this strategizing, this analysis that we've been doing, and putting it into an operationalizable plan with a very clear timeline, roles, what some people would refer to as a MOCA, manager, owner, consultant, helper, approver, and the tactics laid out with the escalation arc. Oftentimes a strategy will look more like a spreadsheet, and a campaign plan will look more like a Google document with a table of contents, right? So I, I I only point this out because a lot of people are in different levels, different stages of strategizing and campaign planning. So to me, the way in my experience that we've done it is you do a few sessions of strategy charting, and then once you've got your strategy pretty well laid out, everyone's on the same page, then you can start putting that into a document that you can share with other people and work off of together. Now, one more question for people. Can anybody tell me the difference between strategy and tactics?
Isn't that the question you just?
Strategy sets the goal, and big level tactics are the small steps for achieving your strategy.
Yeah, that's a pretty good answer. Does anybody else want to shout out what they think?
Well, more specific, more specific steps, actions, tactics.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like we've all got a pretty good idea of this already. Strategy is the macro, tactics are the micro. Strategy is the overarching mission, so the goals you want to achieve and the victories that you're going to need to get there. I think of it as like the giant steps. You've got that laid out where you know what those are going to be. And then the tactics are, like you said, the individual steps you need to achieve each one of those victories. So it's the baby steps between the giant steps. And so I'm going to go into a little bit more on tactics later. All of this just to say that strategy is about looking ahead into the future and coming up with what your overarching plan is going to be, and the theory of change, how you believe you're going to be able to achieve the goals that you set out for yourself. So now I want to move into talking about the strategy chart. Now, when you're talking about strategizing, there's endless numbers of ways that you can go about it. The strategy chart is just one tool that I've been very familiar with, that a lot of colleagues use. It was originally from the Midwest Academy. They are a nonprofit that does, it's kind of like a college for organizing. They have a lot of classes, a lot of tools, some pretty useful stuff. And this is one of their tools that I've used probably more often than any of the other ones. So I'm gonna put it in the chat in a minute, but before I get into it, some fundamentals about it is, first of all, a strategy, and this applies to a campaign plan as well. They are living documents, so they change. They have to be adaptable because new information is going to come in, and politics is one of those things where every action you take changes the situation and therefore informs what the next actions are going to have to be. So in the beginning, we do our best attempt at predicting what's going to happen and what are the possible scenarios we're going to have to respond to. But in reality, a scenario could happen that none of us even like imagined happening. So always being willing to change whatever you come up with. Now, you want to be asking yourself the whole time, what are the elements of a strategy? What are different questions that you want to be asking yourself? Some fundamentals are, beyond adaptability, is equity, inclusion, and justice. I've said it before, and you'll probably hear me say it a couple more times before the end of the training, but these aren't just buzzwords that I'm throwing out there. We want to be diverse, we want to be equitable, we want to be just. These are key concepts that determine the victory, the success of our campaigns, where without true equity and inclusion and justice, we are simply not going to achieve the proper solutions. And we're not going to get there in a truly democratic way. And equity is about having the stakeholders, the people who are impacted by the issue, at the table to help decide the strategy. So you don't bring the strategy chart is your very first attempt at trying to operationalize the equity by reaching out to those people that you want to reach out to, that you don't currently have as part of your cohort, and invite them to the table so they can be a part of producing the strategy. Because you don't want to take the strategy to groups of people and say, can you help me with this? You want to go to them and say, we both agree on the same thing. We want to see the same thing happen, which is protecting land and water and air. I want to work with you to figure out how we can make that happen. Will you come with us to the strategy chart session and then formulate a strategy with them? So at the end of the day, you're not asking them, can you help me with my strategy? You're working with them as a partner to achieve the strategy that both of you came up with together. So now I'm gonna put in the chat a little example strategy chart. It's not fully filled in. This was something that we used in a previous strategy chart training. It's got some answers from like participants from previous trainings, but it also has some comments with more notes that you can read. but this is so you can see the template that we're going to be working on. And I don't think I'm going to share my screen, but I recommend everybody bring it up and kind of follow along with me as we go piece by piece. So you're going to see here that a strategy chart is pretty much broken up into columns. Those are goals, organizational considerations, allies, constituents, and opponents, targets, tactics, and then messaging. So the goals are the first thing that you look at when you're coming up with a strategy. And there's three different types. There's long-term, medium-term, and short-term goals. Now, regardless of which one they are, every goal needs to be SMARTY, which is strategic, measurable, ambitious, realistic, time-bound. We've all heard SMART goals before, but we like to use SMARTY goals. So with an I and an E at the end. So time-bound, inclusive, and equitable. Okay, got somebody asking for me to share. So give me just 1 second so I can do that. I just got to set up my screens properly. Okay. Can y'all see this? Okay, awesome. Yeah, so goals, you can see these are all the different columns of a strategy chart. And now goals have long, medium, and short term. The long-term goal is essentially your North Star. This is your ultimate goal, what we really want to see in the far-flung future, where you could almost think of it as not utopia, because it isn't completely unachievable, but it is so far in the future that it might even be hard to imagine. Medium-term goals is where you start getting a little more specific. Long-term goals can be very broad, very values-driven. So we want a world where everybody has access to clean air and clean water, a world where the climate isn't warming up every single year, and we have stable weather patterns, right? Very, very broad goals. And then medium-term goals are specific things that need to happen to make that world that we want to see possible. So in this example, ending fossil fuel use would be the intermediate goal to achieve a world where everyone has clean air, clean water, and the climate isn't heating up. That's a pretty necessary step. Another one would be building out renewable energy, because as you get off of fossil fuels, you need some kind of energy to replace that, and that's renewable the energy, wind, solar, what have you. Now, short-term goals, this is where the campaign plan and the strategizing comes in, because this is where you choose what is the next victory that we need to achieve for us to achieve those intermediate goals. Intermediate goals can often be seen anywhere from 3 to 10 years down the line. Short-term goals are often within the next year to 3 years. What are things that we need to accomplish immediately? Oftentimes, if we're talking about a legislative campaign plan, the short term will be by the end of this legislative session. And so, 1 second. If I change screens, not that one. Do y'all still see the strategy chart, or do you see my new screen?
We're on the strategy chart.
Okay, cool. Are you still on the strategy chart or a Google document now?
Nope, now we're on a Google document.
Okay. So I think I'm going to stop sharing. Y'all were able to see the big picture, and then for the details, I recommend you follow along. So the organizational considerations, the next step over, this is where the questions you're asking yourself is, what do we have and what do we need in order to accomplish our goals? This is essentially like the taking inventory column, where you look at all of your resources. So that is, how much money do we have? How many people do we have? How many, action takers? How many posters do we have to pass around to people? Whatever it is in terms of a resource, you lay it all out here, and then you ask yourself, where do we want to be in terms of these resources halfway down our campaign or at the end of our campaign? How do we want our campaign to build up our power? So for example, if you look at the template there, you'll see that part of the organizational considerations is not just like the amount of people you have on a list, an action takers list. That's what we have. You also have how many people you want to have on your action taker list by the end of it. So if you've got a committee of 10 people, you would also have in this column, by the end of this, we would like to have 15 people or 20 people, and so on down the line. If you have $10,000, maybe we would like to use this to fundraise an extra $5,000. You do this with every piece of resource that you have, and this is going to help inform your tactics later, where you can ask yourselves, will this tactic help build the power that we determined we needed in this other column? Gonna pause for a quick second. I've thrown a lot out at y'all already. Give y'all a chance to kind of step back, process some of it. Any thoughts, any questions, any hesitations, things that any sticking points that are coming up for anybody here?
One thought on the acronym SMARTY. I've seen SMART before, particularly in the software industry. It's probably project management industry and a few others. And I was curious what the A meant over there, and I looked it up. A there is achievable. So it gets interesting. They're similar, but then they might be opposites. Or actually, we need both, right?
Yeah, I personally, I use both A's, ambitious and achievable. I think it really has to be both. Any other thoughts, comments so far on anything that we've covered?
I have a question when you're thinking about resources or the organizational considerations. Would you think about partners there? Like, is that the right place to kind of think through, like, who are we doing this work with, or does that happen somewhere else?
So I kind of want to say both and, because there is going to be another piece in the strategy chart where we're going to talk about allies. But if you are working on the strategy chart with any of your allies currently, then it would make sense to list out not just the resources you have, but the resources of the coalition in general, or of the whole group of organizations. So if Sierra Club is partnering up with, some other group, and we have 10,000 people on a list, they have an extra 7,000 people, then it would make sense for us on the strategy chart to say, I personally would keep them separate, 10,000, 7,000, and then we would like an extra 3,000 here, an extra 4,000 here. But yeah, I think if you're aware of a resource that you're going to be using, it is a good idea to list it out here just so you to know, and to think about how you can continue to build up on it. Did that answer your question?
It did. Thank you.
No problem. Has anything I've mentioned so far kind of raised any question marks for people in their minds? Anything that that maybe isn't what you were thinking before, or that you're not sure how you feel about it quite yet? All right, we good to move on? All right, cool. So it's the problem with the end of the day. You end up with half a dozen windows and dozens of tabs. So after organizational considerations, we go on to allies, constituents, and opponents. Now, this is the piece that I was just talking about. This is where you ask yourselves, who is we? When we say we want to do this, we are fighting for X, Y, or Z, who is the we? So the constituents are communities, they're groups of people, they're the ones with the most at stake. The way I think about it is these are the people who will be most directly impacted, the ones who are most invested in either the success or the failure of the campaign that we're doing. Constituents are also our ultimate source of power. This is where the people comes from that we're always talking about. And these are also the voices that guide us and that we need to uplift. So in other words, we want people from our constituents as part of the strategizing process, part of the campaign planning process, and every step of the campaign plan from then on out. They are the ones that we want to go to for stories on how have you been impacted by this and what are ways that we can uplift that. These are the ones who will be helping out with the op-eds and all the different, the press interviews to really put the stories out there. Allies, on the other hand, so constituents want what we want for the same reason that we want it. Allies want what we want, but maybe for different reasons, but they still want what we want. These can be individuals, groups, or institutions. And these alliances, they might be temporary. They might not even exist yet. They could be potential allies that you've got in mind. But oftentimes these are the people that will make up your coalition. So when you're thinking of, again, the we, there's the constituents, the people, and then there's the groups that are trying to help what the people want become reality. Now, we also want to take this opportunity to look at who are all of our opponents. Now, this is where a lot of people might, especially on the left, when the people in power, the politicians we might be trying to influence, have the opposite stance of what we have. They're not where we want them to be. A lot of times we can think of them as opponents, but for the purposes of a strategy chart, they are two very different things. Opponents do not have the power to give us what we want. Opponents do not have the decision-making ability in this situation. The opponents are the people on the other side of the coin from us. They are individuals, groups, or institutions who want the opposite of what we want from the same people. They have their own strategy chart, their own campaign plan, their own set of tactics and messaging that they're trying to put out there that is in opposition to what we're doing. They're trying to influence the people against our goal. So the reason we want them on here is because in our campaign plan, we always want to be asking who is acting and who is reacting. So one of the goals of a strategy chart is to allow us to be proactive, to be the ones who are doing the acting, putting our opponents on the back foot, so they're having to respond to us, to react to us, instead of the other way around, where we're constantly on the back foot, always on defense, asking how do we push back against this? How do we fight back against this? Strategy chart helps us be able to be more proactive. Now targets. This is where targets are very different from opponents, even though they might be oppositional, because targets are the people who can give us what we want. They're the ones with the hand on they're the ones with the power. They're the ones with the ultimate decision-making ability. Now, as you can see on the chart, we have primary, secondary, and influencers. So primary targets are the ones who the last person with their finger on the button, who we're trying to get them to either press the button or not press the button. Secondary targets are people who might be part of that process, part of the line of button pressing. So a good example would be President Biden. He's often a primary target in a lot of the things that we're trying to do. But the secondary targets might be people like Deb Haaland, or other heads of agencies that are involved in the process for whatever rule or regulation we might be trying to influence, where their intake, their input, their perspectives, their research is all things that the primary target is going to take into consideration. So secondary targets are who has influence over the people who can give us what we want and have some decision-making ability themselves. This differs from influencers because influencers don't have any of that decision-making ability, but they do have a lot of influence on the primary and secondary people who do. So in this part, you're essentially trying to list out what are all of the potential people who can move our primary target, and what are ways that we can move them to get them to move our primary target. So we're asking ourselves, what do they care about? What moves them? Who moves them? What are the levers that we can pull on? And importantly, what is and isn't in their power? There's no point trying to get a decision maker to make a decision that that person has no decision-making authority over. It just makes no sense. It's a waste of our time. So it's part of this is identifying who truly has the power in this situation. Do another quick pause. Any questions? Any thoughts so far? Cool. So
I have a question. Sorry.
go ahead.
I was just curious if you had any thoughts about sort of when you were talking about constituents and allies, whether you could talk a little bit about when different groups may want the same thing, but disagree about how to do it. Maybe it's like different strategy or different tactics. But if you could say something about that aspect, either now or later. I don't know if it's a now or a later question.
No, this is good. That is, it can get very difficult. Working in coalitions, working with partners, it can get very tough because, like I said, they might want what we want, but they might want it for slightly different reasons. Take just for example, right now we're doing a lot of work with offshore wind. And in this situation where we want offshore wind and Ørsted wants offshore wind. Ørsted wants it because they are the developer who's going to be making money off of the offshore wind. We want offshore wind because we want to get off fossil fuels and have more renewable sources of energy. So we both want the offshore wind project to move forward, but we're doing so for very different reasons. And so those reasons might bring us towards taking very different stances on the targets. So it is something that happens a lot. What I would say is this process, going through a strategy chart and coming up with a campaign plan, this is why it's so important to do it with your coalition, with your allies, and with your constituents, because this is where there's the opportunity for that deliberation to happen, for all these discussions to be had. Because at the end of the day, that's really what it's going to take is trust and relationships. So that's something I didn't even mention, but that would underlie even this training. This would be like a precursor training to that, is that we can, and I know we've all heard this so many times before, but cliches are cliches for a reason. You can only move at the speed of trust. So what the solution to situations where you might disagree with allies on tactics is going to come down to how much of a relationship do you have with them, where you're able to, at the end of the day, remember that while we might disagree on this tactic, we're still on the same page, we're still on the same side, and we still want to get the same thing done. So let's just see if there's any opportunity here for us to meet halfway, to compromise, or at the end of the day, it might even just be that we're going to have to part ways on this tactic and come back together on the next one. Sometimes that's okay too. The trick is to just make sure that the thing that both sides want to do isn't going to undermine the other side. So that's something that when I've worked in coalitions, when we can't agree on the tactic that we as a coalition are going to take, we do just make sure that the differing tactics other groups are going to take does not undermine the messaging in any way whatsoever. And if it does, then there's broader conversations that need to happen about the coalition itself and the structure of it, and the, you know, the ins and outs of who's in and out of a coalition. And I know there's no easy answer. They are, like I said, very difficult situations, but hopefully just keeping some of these core concepts in mind: trust, relationships, and being adaptable. So being able to go into and out of alliances as the tactics require can hopefully help guide you through some of those more difficult situations. Does that help at all?
That's super helpful. Thank you.
No problem. Roger?
Yeah, I think I heard you say that there's a primary target, but there can be secondary targets, and then there are influencers, and there's a distinction. And what, in my mind, what I'm thinking of is, okay, in the state legislature, Ron Mariano and a few of his henchmen are really the primary target. He's pretty much in control of everything. But say committee chairs are maybe somewhat influential around him. So they would be secondary targets. And then in terms of the committee chairs, then we're looking at all the various lobbyists and other folks, and also their kind of colleagues in the legislature who might be buddies with them, who we could reach out to. Those are the influencers. I mean, is that sort of what you're talking about?
Absolutely. Yeah, that was pretty much on point. So the committee chairs, I would say they are influential, but I would say those are the secondary targets, because
right. Yes,
they have some power themselves.
Right, exactly. Should there be another column for secondary targets? In the version I have, I just have primary and not secondary.
Yeah, so this was part of this was a little butchered from the previous training that as we were working on things. I think that might have deleted, but
okay, I got it. I'm gonna add that to my copy. Thanks.
Yeah, normally, and you do want to align, like, this is the primary target, these are the secondary targets for this primary, and these are the influencers for this primary, because you might even have different primaries, and each one has different sets of influences. One other thing I'll throw out about that is one way to think about it is primary and secondary are both within the sphere of power. Influencers can be anywhere. So you can get real creative with the influencers. I've heard some of the best examples from previous trainings I've heard people use were situations where they had a volunteer who is close friends with somebody who goes to church with the primary target. And then they got their friend to talk to their person in church in the context of their religion, asking why they support that. And then that moved the target like massively, because even though this influencer had no power themselves, they had the ear of the primary and was able to move them.
So I should start going to Ron Mariano's church, I guess. I'll work on that. Thanks very much.
David?
Yeah, can a target be like a group of people or a community? The thing comes to mind is a campaign a couple of years back. BlackRock has a major problem. Technically, well, one target is Mr. Fink, and he was shown very specifically, but sometimes I think our actual target was the members of the public who need to get educated on what BlackRock is doing, and that's not a single entity, it's multiple entry. So first of all, could you have both of them as targets? And also, what if your target is not an individual?
So thank you for asking, because that's a crucial piece that I left out. Targets are individuals, and only individuals. Now I say that, but institutions and groups are how you can start identifying those individuals. So I would personally, like in my thinking of things, I would think of BlackRock as being a target, but that would just be the first step. For what I would put in the strategy chart is BlackRock is the target. So now let me Google BlackRock and see who's at the head of BlackRock, who's the CEO, who are the board members that are on the board of BlackRock, what are their names, because you can't at the end of the day, people make decisions, and people are composed of individuals. And at the end of the day, there's going to be an individual who will make a decision that we either will like or won't like. And so it's extremely important that we're very clear on who that individual is, while keeping in mind that BlackRock, for example, might be a broader entity that surrounds that target, where we can identify other secondary targets and influencers. And it's an extremely important piece of context to keep in mind. Now, the piece you said about the people being the target of the messaging, that is more like, it's not so much that they are the target, it's more like they are the audience of your messaging. And what they really are is the constituents who can influence your primary target, but they are not a target in a strategy chart, simply because they're not the ones who have the power to give us what we want, or who have the ultimate decision-making ability, as like the individual. So to summarize, in other words, it's helpful to identify targets in the sense of entities, organizations, institutions, offices, but to do so as a means to an end of identifying who the individual is, but keeping in mind the broader context they sit in. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, got it.
Cool.
Maybe quite a search to find that person, but it got the answer.
Yeah, so another big thing about strategy charts is they take multiple sessions. And some of that's because as you're going through a strategy chart, you're going to be identifying research needs. And so you can see that on the far right. That's something you always want to keep in mind as you're going through each piece. You're going to have questions like, oh, I think it's BlackRock, but who's the individual in BlackRock? Okay, we need somebody to find that information and put it in there for us. Or it could be like, how many people do we have on our list? It's been a while since we've checked. We need somebody to go in there and pull that for us and put that in here. So yeah, a strategy is not going to be one meeting. You sit down, everything goes on the chart, and you can move on. It's going to be a bit of a process getting it done. But looking at time, we've got 7 minutes. I just want to go over 2 more pieces real quick, and then pass it over to Celeste to close us out. So for tactics, this is where it can get pretty fun, and where the volunteers and everybody really, but particularly people who are newer to the process, this is where they can kind of get hooked onto the whole process, because this is where you can get really creative and start thinking about what are the full spectrum of possibilities we can think of that might influence our targets. Now, tactics, keep in mind, they are time-bound with specific roles and action items. So tactics are very specific. And every tactic should build power for the next tactic. So if your tactic does not build power, you should ask yourself, why? Is there a way that it could? And if it doesn't, is it worth the capacity? Is it worth the power it takes to do the tactic if it's not going to build more power? And always keep in mind an escalation arc. So oftentimes, especially when we're dealing with really emotionally intense issues, we want to do the action that matches our intensity, right? So we want to go with the biggest, the flashiest, the most powerful action right from the beginning, because that's how much we believe in it. The only thing is that if you start off out of the gate with everything that you have, with your most powerful tactic, if that doesn't work, where do you go from there? You don't have anything to follow up with. And oftentimes at the start of a campaign, there's a good chance you're not going to have the power you need to achieve the result. Part of your campaign is going to be building up that power that you need so you can ultimately have the power to do that big tactic that's really going to push the target over the edge to supporting us. So the smaller your power, the smaller the tactic, because you also don't want to promise that if you don't do what we say on this, then you're going to lose your office because we're going to get people to vote against you. If you're a group of 5 people and you haven't done any voter outreach whatsoever, then if you say that and then that doesn't happen, next time you go out there, nobody's going to listen to you. So you don't want to bite off more than you can chew when it comes to tactics, or it can backfire. And then tactics, keep in mind, are not always oppositional either. You can target tactics towards allies if these are decision makers themselves. So if you have a primary target who you also listed in your allies column because there's somebody who's been really helpful on this, sometimes you might want to do a tactic that just demonstrates your power in a way that celebrates your ally, to uplift their support, give them some cover if they're getting a lot of political fire for supporting you. And as a reminder that, look, we do have power. So you're not just, you don't just happen to be on the same side as us. You're gaining something from being on the same side of us. So when you have these tactics, first you brainstorm. So you come up with your group and you just throw all the ideas out there. And then you start prioritizing and laying out what the escalation arc is going to be. And then you start putting them into action. To say a bit more on the escalation arc, you start off with a small bit of leverage, and then you build that up over time. There's a constant, it's just like a negotiation, right? If you say, like, we're going to come in and we're going to lobby you, and it's going to be me and 2-3 other people, and we're going to ask you, do you support, do you not, why not? And we're going to ask you to support. If you say no, then we're going to come back and we're going to lobby you again, but this time we're going to bring a group of people from your voting district and have you explain to them, or people who are directly impacted, have you explain to them face to face why you won't protect them. If that still doesn't work, then we might have a much larger group of people send in comments or postcards to that elected official. If that's still not moving them, we might start deciding, okay, we might have to go public with this, start putting broader pressure on them. So we're going to put out an op-ed where we're going to take some of the stories of the people we brought to that second lobby meeting, and we're going to give it to the press and ask them to uplift that story. And we're going to put it out there with a press conference where we're going to have people sharing their story, invite the press, and calling out the target by name, saying they are refusing to protect us. Why is that? And you can just keep building up and building up and building up to the really some of the more powerful tactics, which could even be, it's like so I don't actually, in the broader sense, could be even up to civil disobedience, although I don't think we do civil disobedience at the Sierra Club, but just as an example of, like, you can keep escalating, but you don't start off with the civil disobedience. You start off with the simple ask, will you support us? No? Okay, then what's next? And now for messaging, this is a major arena of any campaign, is the public sphere. Our power comes from the public. They're the ones who stand to benefit, and so we need them on our side. This is where the battle of ideas takes place. The key thing when it comes to messaging is to control the framing. So you think of I know we hear this word a lot, but to really go into what framing actually means, think of when you have a painting hanging on a wall and you have a framing that frames it, right? A framing is the bigger picture that your message sits within. A good example of this is going back to the offshore wind. Some of what we were having to respond to was the opposition framing the issue as it being whales versus wind. So if you support one, you're against the other. And what we decided was what we needed to do was completely change that framing, because if we argue that no, wind is not bad for whales and whales are not bad for wind, we're using their framing, and we're still playing with the ball on their court essentially. So what we need to do is change the framing. We don't say wind versus whales. We just say very simply, like, whales are threatened by climate change, shipping, and fishing entanglements. And wind energy is a solution to climate change that we need in order to achieve our goals, whether we're referencing Biden's goals in the IRA and America the Beautiful, our Wild America, or if we want to refer to our own goals, it's like we need the wind in order to stop climate change and therefore save the whales. We're getting rid of that dichotomy of wind versus whales, and we're choosing a framing on whales and a framing on wind and supporting both of those. We need to protect whales and we need to advance wind. And by the way, there's no anti going on there whatsoever. So just keeping in mind that when you're talking about messaging, it's not just what is the talking point that you're going to use. It is what are the broader values? What's the broader story that your talking point is telling? Is that the way you're framing the issue in people's minds. Another thing to keep in mind is values drive your messaging, and they are at the center of it. And oftentimes, really effective messaging starts off with the values. There's a really simple formula I like to refer to. It's values, problem, solution. So oftentimes, if you're struggling, you got to come up with a quick talking point off the top of your head. Just remember that formula and you'll end up with something pretty good. So could be, we believe in a world where everyone has a right to clean drinking water. But right now, we've got many people with lead in their pipes who are drinking leaded water. And so we need the city to go in and fix these lead pipes. You start off with the values, you gave a quick problem, and then you gave your solution that you want. So there's so much more I could say about every one of these pieces. I was going to do a whole recap, but we're already past time. I don't want to hold y'all an extra minute than I have already. Sorry for going over, but I just want to offer just a quick time for anybody. If you have any questions, any thoughts you want to say before I pass it over to Celeste to close this out. Mallory, go ahead.
I have hopefully a quick question. Do you have any advice on, I guess, like scope, right? So like, say we want, like our broad goal is like conservation in Massachusetts, but there's like water work and there's forestry work. And then even within that, there's like different parts of the state that are working on different things. Like, how do you decide what level your campaign should be at?
That's a really good question. I think when I'm answering a question like that, I start off with the organizational considerations. So I use my inventory of the resources I have, the power, the capacity I have, to help me figure out what is the A in my SMARTY goals, what is achievable, right? And then I will use that to help determine the scope. So if I'm planning with a team and we're just in one part of the state, then I might choose a goal that is tailored more towards what that part of the state can affect, rather than something more statewide. If you're doing statewide planning, then you would want to do that. But for example, this originally came about from helping Celeste with the forest protection team as they're going through some campaign planning, and they're already pretty ahead on this strategy chart, making great progress. But basically they I'm sorry, I just blanked out. I'm sorry, repeat the question for me real quick. It's late in the night.
No problem, no problem. Just how do you kind of decide what level your goals should be at? Like, should we have in one campaign plan goals for like 3 different forestry actions we want to have in Massachusetts, or do we have a different campaign plan for each one?
Yeah, so I think you would want one campaign plan for each short-term goal is the way I've always done it. So you can have multiple goals, long, medium, and short term. Each short term should be connected to a specific medium-term goal, but then each one of those short-term goals are the ones where you're going to need a campaign plan. So, for example, with let's say a short-term goal in a legislative campaign is to pass a certain bill. You might have 3 different bills, 3 different short-term goals that you want to pass, but each bill is going to have their own set of targets, legislators, coalitions, constituents, therefore tactics. And so you might want to have a campaign plan, a strategy chart for each one of them, but any chances to tie the 3 together will make each one more powerful. So if there's ways that you can double up on tactics, double up on targets, on messaging, then you can do so. So, but yeah, it can get a little, it can be a bit much if you have too many goals. So if you find that you have too much strategizing to do, that might be a sign that you've got too many goals that you're trying to accomplish. And you might want to pare that down a bit so you can really put your energy into something that's really going to move, instead of trying to divide up your energy amongst a lot of different things where none of them might not move very much.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
David?
Yeah. Just briefly, and right at the end, you talked about controlling the framing. Can you relate that to combating disinformation and how to go about doing that?
Yeah, so this can be, you could ask a dozen people and get a dozen different answers on this. I'm not saying I'm right, but the trick with that is you get a lot of people who say that when it comes to disinformation, when it comes to the other side's talking points, some people say that you shouldn't even respond to it whatsoever, because responding to disinformation is alerting people to that disinformation, and it's repeating the disinformation. Even if you're combating the disinformation, you just repeated it, and now it's out there, and more outlets, more people are going to see that original disinformation. So what some people would say is, for example, they're out there saying that offshore wind is killing whales. Instead of us fighting back and saying, no, offshore wind is not killing whales, which is using their framing, we might just say, like, whales are dying from ship strikes, and whales are dying from ship strikes because climate change is moving their food sources closer to the shipping lanes, and we have more shipping than we ever had before. And wind energy is how you solve climate change. So in other words, you've combated the disinformation by putting the truth out there, but in a way that doesn't repeat the disinformation in the first place. So it can be a bit of a trick. And a lot of times our opponents are going to be baiting us. They're going to want us to respond to their ludicrous claims and their absurdity, because then that keeps the mic on them. And so, you know, sometimes they might say some really outlandish stuff. You just laugh about it with your allies and then come up with what is your messaging that you want to put out there to the people. Lynn, I don't have any slides for this, unfortunately, just the strategy chart template. But I am going to put together a few links with more resources on these kind of things for people to maybe do a little extra background reading if you want.
Thank you, Gabe.
No problem. Oh, we got this till 7. Sweet. Sorry, y'all. I thought this was an hour and a half, so I was really rushing myself. But
It is an hour and a half. We just started at 5:30.
Oh, okay.
But no worries. Yeah, so more time for people to like gel with questions here, which one thing that I've been gelling with is the prioritizing tactics part. Is partly where the forest protection team is. hello everybody. Since you've alluded, we are working on a strategy chart, and one thing I've also gotten out of today is that we completely messed up the section of the chart with primary targets, secondary target, and influencers. I think we just kind of mixed a lot of people all together at once there. So we might be relooking at that part. But in terms of like the big thing we're working towards is trying to prioritize the tactics into a timeline. And creating that escalation arc feels tricky to me in terms of like, yeah, this is a poorly formed question, but I'm curious if you have any like advice about like balancing the different viewpoints and really coming to consensus around what like a good escalation arc looks like.
So is the question more around when tactics should take place, or is it more about what level the tactics should be at when they take place?
I think both. I think part of what I'm getting at is like evaluating as you're going is important. So like how much to pre-plan versus how much to like react to how level, say, step 1 goes.
Yeah. So I think what we've done in the past in some like previous strategy charts that we've had, we look at kind of phases of a campaign. And so we might look at, by the end of this phase, we're going to want this amount of movement to have happened. And if we see that, then we de-escalate a bit and we move on to this set of tactics. If by this time and this tactics we've done, we don't see any movement, then we might choose to escalate to this other set of tactics instead. So the cool thing about tactics is you can escalate by moving on to a different, more escalatory tactic. You can also escalate within tactics. So the example I had before with lobbying, you could have a very low level lobbying visit where it's just information gathering. You're just asking like, are you for it? Are you against it? If not, what's keeping you from supporting it? What are your hesitations? It's very low stakes, right? There's not a whole lot of pressure. We're not bringing them. We're not like flooding their room with people. But then we might decide to escalate that. And we can escalate that all the way up to an office sit-in, where we're not just bringing a bunch of people into their office, we're refusing to leave their office until they give us what we want. So you can escalate within a tactic and you can escalate between tactics. But what I would say is to, when you're coming up with a broader strategy chart, if you're getting too hung up on specific tactics, try to think about what are the broad sets of tactics that you would like to take. So in this period, we're going to be doing lobbying. By this period, lobbying isn't going to get us too much more. So we're going to be doing public events. You know, it's going to be some press, it's going to be some people speaking, it might be rallies, it might be performances, but we'll put that in this section of the timeline. And at the end of the timeline, if we're still not seeing any movement, we're going to need our big stuff happening here. So we're going to want a big rally or a big protest event. And so you can kind of just have these like checkpoints in your strategy chart that lets you decide like, okay, we escalate or we de-escalate now. And then in between those tactics, as new stuff happens, things change and you're going to have to be adapting. It's between these tactics that you realize like, the last one was a little too much. We might want to pare it down a little on this next one. Or the last one was not nearly enough. We could have done so much more. Let's do that on the next one. But one just quick tip. Generally, I try to not plan anything with less than 2 weeks of advance planning. Preferably, because for tactics to really happen, you know, they got to be right. If you try to put on a tactic and you rush it and it goes badly, they can backfire, especially if the press is involved. If you say, we're going to try to get a bunch of people out there for this press conference, and then the press conference day comes around and you're running around with, like a chicken with your head cut off, trying to make sure the speakers were right and they had their talking points, and the press showed up. And I might be speaking from experience, and you didn't do any of the actual organizing you needed to bring people to it, then the press shows up and there's more journalists than people there. So, you know, that doesn't look great. So give yourself plenty of time, think through these tactics in advance, and if it helps, work backwards. Work from like the very last part of the timeline. What's the biggest event we're going to want to put on in order to, if assuming we haven't made any progress, and what's the power we're going to need to make that happen? And then what are the tactics we can take before we get there to slowly build up our power? So the lobbying meetings, their chances to recruit people to come out to them, to become volunteers. If you do press conferences, those can be opportunities for these people in the lobby meeting to build up their leadership and do some public speaking and bring their friends with them this time. And if we do a protest, a larger rally, you can use social media to try to bring new people into this. And so at each step of the way, you've got more and more and more people who are joining your fight at different steps of it. So hopefully at the end of it, you can shout back out to all those people at all those different steps and be like, remember that work you did? Well, this is it. This is the last big push we have, the last big chance we have to move this issue. So come to X, Y, or Z. Did that help at all? I know it's a bit of a tough situation. It's a tough nut to crack.
No, it definitely did. I appreciate that, and want to open the floor in case other folks have questions that they've been sitting with.
As people think of other questions or thoughts, even comments, if there's just stuff that y'all are thinking, do you want to dig in a little bit more on that? Tell me a bit more about like what are some of the sticking points around tactics?
I don't know that we've gotten to the point of sticking points. Like we have a brainstormed list of tactics that we sorted generally into like high engagement and low engagement. And I'm just anticipating that when we try to actually put it to a timeline, that's going to be the hardest part of all of it. So yeah, not exactly sticking points yet, so much as just being very new to all of this and feeling uncertainty.
No, that's you're thinking about it right though. You're anticipating what the next like problem could be, which it can be a little difficult figuring out how you match your tactics with your timeline. And I'll definitely help you out. I'll be part of those conversations as you try to think that through. But use dates as like just the first step to getting a timeline set out. So for example, comment period ends at this time. At this time, a report needs to be issued by the agency. And at this time, that report needs to be adopted. And that report needs to get through a committee at this time. And at this time, the governor actually makes a decision. You know, this examples of like different steps of a process. It's good to have each one of those things laid out on your timeline, because each one of those steps of a process could inform your tactics, and each one could have different secondary targets before you get to your primary target. And so it's a good first step towards helping you lay out your tactics in a way that makes sense. Any other thoughts, questions, even beyond this, going from this to a campaign plan, concept of power? Roger, go ahead. You're muted, Roger.
A challenge that we often face, in fact, in Elders Climate Action, is the fact that there are a lot of organizations out there with the same goal and working on their own strategy and their own tactics and their own campaign, and they're not really ready to kind of come together around this. So if you've got other folks who are your allies, but who are on have a different set of strategy and tactics, how important is it to coordinate? I mean, aside from building a coalition, which you really would like to have, that works together, are there any, can you give us any advice about how to manage that kind of situation?
So when you say they have different tactics, strategy charts, are they simply a parallel set of tactics and strategies, or are they like butting heads? Are they rubbing against each other?
I think they're not really opposed to each other, but they're not coordinated in any way. And it sounds to me like there's the potential for power and influence is reduced in the absence of the coordination.
Yeah, so I generally believe that that's the biggest thing, is you're leaving power on the table. The less you coordinate, the less you collaborate. That's more power that you could use that you're not using, essentially. But there is also the possibility that with the lack of coordination, things might happen even unintentionally that ends up undermining your campaign. One example I can point to is this was a local climate thing we had going on. There was a planning process, and one of the groups ended up disagreeing with our some part of the planning process, and they decided they were going to do their own tactic on their own date. But then the scheduling of their tactic ended up being bad for the scheduling of the coalition tactic, where it kind of would have split up the people who would have gone to one, was then choosing, do we go to one or the other one? And you, instead of having one large rally, you had two smaller rallies because people were kind of split between the two. So sometimes a lack of coordination can be actively harmful.
Right, right. Good, thanks.
Then?
Yeah, just to follow up on what Roger just said, like the example that I could think of with Elders Climate Action is they're super, super good at having educational programs. I mean, our issues align in many areas. They're sometimes they have a little bit different focus than us, but we're always in alignment, I feel like. But they're super good at public outreach and education, and we're maybe better and they're really good at organizing around lobbying as well. We could probably coordinate with them on some of those areas and get further, have a further reach. So I'm just emphasizing what you guys already said, but I feel like we could maximize our power if we're working a little bit more closely together.
Yeah. We would like to do that. And we're continuing to work on it.
And something I really like about what you pointed out, Lynn, just to further emphasize the point, is that like you mentioned, different groups have different strengths and different weaknesses, right? We all bring something different to the table. And so Sierra Club, we've got people. We have a lot of people, a lot of the grassroots. We can turn people out to things. Something I've learned we kind of lack sometimes can be the expert knowledge. So like a expert, master of this specific knowledge who can help us look at this plan and determine, does this follow the science or does this not? We do in a lot of cases, and we have a lot of cases members, volunteers who are experts in their own work.
Yeah, and I would say that that's one of our big strengths in Sierra Club, is that, at least on the forest protection team, is we do have some really strong experts, with deep knowledge of both ecology and systems and economics and like all sorts of things that tie together our issues that are important in moving towards change.
Yeah.
So I feel like we could benefit maybe from doing a little bit more coordination.
Mm-hmm. No, we definitely do. But then you've also got some organizations that have no grassroots whatsoever. They don't do any public outreach, but they are all expert, right? They're all just academics, researchers. They're the ones who are coming out with the science themselves. And so partnering with those groups, we can use their name recognition as the source of the knowledge. and then we can use our people and work with them, put the two together, really advance you know, any kind of campaign. So yeah, the more we can collaborate, the better. And it's not just with other groups, but with the people within our group. So even within the Sierra Club, we have a lot of people. So can we bring more of those people from being just online action takers to coming to these meetings, joining these strategy conversations, being part of the planning process? You know, at every step we're asking, how can we bring more and more and more people into this? Because the more people, the more collaboration, the more strengths you have to pull from.
Yeah, thank you.